I can see it.
Okay, so just tell me when you want me to go next.
Great. Okay, let's go next. Well, first, good morning, everyone. Good to see all these fresh faces early Friday morning, ready to hear about waterlogging or flooding. Well, unlike Southern Florida, in California, we mainly struggle with drought and lack of water, right? But then we have global climate change, and we see this increase in the air temperature, and it has some impacts on other climatic variables like heavy rainfall. Exactly what happened this winter in California due to the global climate change. We had that atmospheric rivers getting active, and we got those heavy rainfall. Could possibly impact avocado and citrus orchards, especially those orchards planted on heavy soils or those that didn't have the drainage system. So then we can have flooding, or not even flooding, just simply waterlogging, and we should be prepared for that. We should learn how it impacts the crop physiology, how it impacts the growth and yield and survival of avocado trees, which diseases are associated with this problem, and how we can really deal with such issues. Let's talk about that today. Next, please. Why flooding develops in agricultural fields? Usually it's either natural causes, like flooding can occur, especially in flooding-prone regions, or it could be your soil compaction. It's very heavy, holds onto water, and causes waterlogging and flooding. Or we might play a role in this as human beings. We might use improper irrigation practice, or we might have a poor site selection for our orchards. So all these factors could contribute to flooding and waterlogging in our orchards. Next, please. Next, okay. But avocado specifically is very susceptible to soil flooding. Why is that? Because as we all know, it has a very shallow root system, which cannot spread really much beyond the canopy of the trees. And it has few root hairs, poor water uptake, but it's very supervised. That means it has low hydraulic conductivity and very much sensitive to low soil oxygen concentrations. So all these characteristics make avocado very susceptible and sensitive, first to lack of oxygen and then waterlogging. So next. But the question is, what is waterlogging? Waterlogging simply means when you have a lot of water around the root zone, when water comes to the soil at a faster rate that it can drain away. It usually happens, as I mentioned, because of heavy rainfall. You might do over irrigation, there should be, or flooding, or sometimes in some regions we have high water table. All these can cause waterlogging. But duration and severity of waterlogging usually depend on the amount of water that comes to the soil system, the topography of the site, and soil structure. But what is soil structure? Here in this picture, you see a normal soil structures. So as Mary Lou mentioned, 30%, we have like large pores and we have small pores. So 30% are large pores in a normal soil structures that are usually filled with air, like oxygen and other gases. And 10% are small pores that usually are filled with water. In waterlogging situation, water fills both small and large pores. So what happens? There is no oxygen available for the root system. And as I mentioned, avocado is very much sensitive to the lack of oxygen. So this situation is called hypoxia. Next, please. So hypoxia then is any reduction of oxygen below optimal levels, which is necessary for functioning of the plant, organ, or cell. Look at this picture. I mean, imagine the root system like our lungs. If oxygen is available, they can thrive. If oxygen is not available, there is no respiration and roots can die. So usually hypoxia means when we have less than 2 milligram oxygen in 1 liter of water in our soils, which usually in poorly drained soils, or in short-term flooding, it can occur. Next, please. Okay, then lack of oxygen or hypoxia is one of the most important limiting factors in waterlogging soils. So what happens when roots don't have oxygen? Obviously, they can't breathe, they can't function normally. They cannot uptake water and nutrient and send them up to the canopy. So tree shows some physiological responses. Imagine it's an avocado tree, right? The first that happens, a signal goes up to the canopy and asks for leaves to close your stomata because we're in the emergency situation. When such a thing happens, of course, the stomata are closed, transpiration comes down, and then carbon dioxide absorption also goes down. These are the initial physiological responses from avocado tree to waterlogging situations. Next, please. Okay, when those responses occur, then we see the canopy decline. So what happens, as Mary Lou also briefly mentioned, we will have leaf drop, fruit drop. We have leaf size reduction. We have reduction in photosynthesis. Underground, we will have root necrosis. And in general, we have inhibition in root growth and also in shoot growth. Okay, next. Okay, so far, we know what is waterlogging. We know the physiological response or the general symptoms that we would see on avocado canopy in response to waterlogging. But the question is, which diseases are triggered by waterlogging or flooding in general? It's Phytophthora species. We all know Phytophthora cinnamomi, the cause of Phytophthora root rot, the major disease of avocado around the world. So look at this disease triangle. We have host, which is avocado, if pathogen is available in the soil, and then environmental factors. What is the environmental factor conducive for Phytophthora to work well is water. So the reduction, so when roots are gone because of the flooding, of course, there is an imbalance between canopy volume and root volume, but it can be exacerbated if the pathogen is in the soil, if you have Phytophthora cinnamomi in your soils. Next, please. But why? Why waterlogging is very important for Phytophthora? It's because of the nature of these fungi. They belong to oomycetes. They have these structures, these spores that are called zoospore. They can swim. So they have to swim in order to reach the root tips. And in order to swim, obviously, they need water. That's why water is very crucial and important. And if we have flooding or waterlogging in our orchards, we are creating the perfect situation for Phytophthora cinnamomi, if it's already in your soil, to thrive and to mess up with the orchard. So let's together review this life cycle. For instance, here we have a dead avocado, imagine avocado tree, right? If you zoom on the root tip, then we would see mycelia, and then we have these spore sacs that we call them in mycology sporangia. Or sometimes they have these survival structures that are called chlamydospore. So when water is available, when the situation is conducive, then these spore sacs or chlamydospore release zoospores, and those zoospores swim and they reach the root tips. The reason why, because it's an attracted place for them, because it has carbohydrate and amino acid for those zoospores. Next, please. But do you think it's only zoospore motility? Water is available because zoospores can move. It's not only that, because when waterlogging is there, of course, as I mentioned, we have hypoxia. There is no oxygen available. So tree becomes weak. And the general defensive system is affected. So trees become more susceptible to any pathogen which is in the soil. So it could be tree susceptibility, or flooding could make some changes in soil chemistry. We have more pathogen activity and zoospore mortality, and combination of these factors is very much important for Phytophthora root rot. Next, please. There's this paper in South Africa, 2014. They did this experiment. They compared Duke7 and DUSA, which I thought it would be interesting to share with you the results. They tested Duke7 and DUSA under three different situations: under flooding alone, under Phytophthora root rot conditions alone, and the combination of both. And let's see what happens. What was the response? Well, obviously, flooding had an immediate impact on root health, even greater than when trees were only infected with Phytophthora cinnamomi. If you look at this picture, we have healthy control plants, which is A, flooded plants, flooded alone is B, and then C, we have infected plants with Phytophthora cinnamomi. Just compare these two pictures. And D, we have the combination of Phytophthora and flooding. So combination of flooding and Phytophthora cinnamomi had the most devastating impact and caused extensive root necrosis and wilting. But symptoms, visible symptoms were generally more severe in Duke7 compared to DUSA. For instance, 10 days after flooding started, Duke7 would show symptoms, but DUSA maybe showed 16 to 20 days after flooding occurred. Next, please. And then here, let's take a look at DUSA in response to Phytophthora. Well, in general, for DUSA, we see an initial decline in all those physiological factors, right? I talk about carbon dioxide absorption. I talked about, reduction in transpiration and also stomata conductance, right? Stomata closure. Of course, we have an initial decline in DUSA after infection with Phytophthora. But here what happens? DUSA recovered faster after being exposed to Phytophthora infestant. So those physiological response got better, and part of that was because of regeneration of feeder roots. While in Duke7, there was no recovery simply, and which suggests that it has relative Phytophthora root rot tolerance. Next, please. And I assume that we all know that DUSA is a bit more tolerant to Phytophthora root rot. That's why the conclusion could be, if it can recover from those physiological responses, that it can reopen its stomata after infection with Phytophthora cinnamomi, it might be able also to recover from flooding. That's a subject that we can discuss with each other. Then keep in mind that avocado trees that are flooded in the presence of Phytophthora cinnamomi succumb to death much faster than those trees that were flooded, but in the absence of Phytophthora cinnamomi. But it wasn't only about the infection, but physical and chemical properties of the soils were also important. In fine texture soils, which are poorly drained and have a greater proportion of micropores, were much more, of course, the situation was worse in such situations. Next, please. Okay, good. So we know which diseases we have so far. Phytophthora, it's not only Phytophthora root rot, the trunk also, Phytophthora affecting trunk, Phytophthora mengi, if I can call that. That's also one of the pathogens that can get worse when waterlogging situation is there. But let's review the symptoms of Phytophthora. We know Phytophthora cinnamomi, the cause of Phytophthora root rot, belong to Oomycetes, has these survival structures that can stay in the soil for years. So when your soil is infected, don't wait for any magic. It'll be there. All we can do, we can mitigate the situation. So symptoms, it's a soil-borne pathogens. Pathogen can affect roots, especially feeder roots, make them black and brittle, unlike the whitish and creamy color of healthy roots. And in the advanced stages of infection, feeder roots are totally gone. All you can see is the major root. Next, please. When roots are infected, then later you see some symptoms in the canopy, right? You see canopy decline. Next, please. Leaves become wilted. Next, please. And then you see the gradual decline in the canopy. And next, please, if trees are old, you see the gradual decline, but if they are young, they can even die due to Phytophthora root rot infection. Okay, let's move on. So far, what is waterlogging? What effects it had on physiological response of a tree, and also the symptoms in the canopy, and which diseases are triggered by waterlogging and flooding. But what could we do, really? What is the solution? You know, here's a simple thing that I want to talk about. When flooding occurs, when you have waterlogging situation in your orchards, obviously part of your roots are gone, they're damaged, right? And then there is this imbalance between the canopy volume and the root volume. So the balance between shoot to root ratio is already out of control, right? Based on experience and observations, and also some studies later done in some containers, there is this suggestion: if you prune the canopy right after flooding, that might help trees to recover from flooding stress better. Why is that? Because you now, by removing part of the canopy and reducing the size of the canopy, you're bringing that shoot to root ratio back into balance, right? Now those remained roots can actually afford the canopy. They can send, water up or nutrients up, but less transpiration you have up there. The tree weight in general comes down, and overall it can be very helpful. Next. But the question is, what if we prune before the flooding? So studies shows, again, we will have an imbalance, right? Imagine that now you have a high root volume, but your canopy volume is way less. So if you prune before flooding, roots are already damaged with hypoxia, but then they don't even have carbohydrate reservoir for themselves, because we had less leaves up there, less photosynthesis, less carbohydrate were translocated down to the roots. Right? In general, due to these assumptions, it says that if you prune before flooding, that's not going to help avocado trees to recover from flooding. But we can discuss also this after the presentation. Next, please. What else we could do? If there is no natural flooding and you only overwater, so don't overwater. That could help with waterlogging, right? If you have especially Phytophthora in your orchard, don't overwater. Check the soil type. If it's clay and heavy, of course, the situation would be worse than those sandy soils. In such situations, right after flooding, walk into your orchard, mark those regions that might have poor drainage. And if it's possible, do something about the drainage. I don't know, dig some drains maybe, let water goes away. Or, next please, in the long run, maybe you could do a better mounding, just plant the trees in a row on a better mounding. That might help. If really trees are badly affected by flooding and you can't do anything, the only suggestion is just replant, and then for the future plantation, make sure you have a good surface, drainage, subsurface drainage system maybe should be installed, or better mounding plantation would also help. Next, please. And in general, regardless of flooding and waterlogging situation for Phytophthora root rot, we also mentioned before in our presentations, a combination of different methods like sanitation, like using clean nursery stock, planting in mounds, as I mentioned, good irrigation management, using mulches and gypsum and chemicals, and maybe planting tolerant rootstock would be helpful. Next, please. For nursery stock, of course, disease nursery stock is the #1 factor responsible for the disease spread, especially if you don't have it in your orchard. Make sure you're getting trees from a good nursery that is mindful of using clean seed, clean water, disinfected soil, and practice some sanitations. Next, please. You have it in your orchard, sanitation is very much important, because fungus can spread on everything. It doesn't matter. You can walk into your orchard, boots can transfer the fungus. The ladder that you're using, boxes and bees, anything in touch with soil and water which is infected with zoospore can really spread the pathogen from this orchard to another or within one orchard. So sanitation always comes first. Next, please. Yeah, here's a picture showing that, that you should really use good nursery trees and also be mindful of anything that could spread the pathogen in your orchard, like your boots, simply. Next, please. Gypsum and mulch. Applying these two in your orchard is good because it can improve water conservation. It can help with soil temperature. It can add a lot of nutrient content to the soil. So it can increase the biological activity and also some physical properties of the soil. And it can suppress the soil-borne diseases because it increases the microbial activity. Next, please. So what you do, first apply gypsum under mulching, maybe 25-pound gypsum under the canopy of each medium-sized tree. Calcium in gypsum usually suppresses the formation of Phytophthora spores and makes soil more porous and helps water, air, and nutrient to penetrate the soil. Next, please. And then on top of that, you can apply mulch, those wood chip mulch that are very light, right? And when you apply that, make sure that it's about 6 to 8 inches away from the base of the tree, the trunk. And mulching can add, especially for avocado that we have shallow root system, it can add a layer of protection for roots from too much heat or cold. But here's the point. In waterlogged situation, they could also, because they're very light, those wood chips can also absorb excess water. That could be also helpful in waterlogging situations. Next, please. And then chemical controls, that's another option that you could use. Again, I mentioned when Phytophthora root rot is the orchard, you can't really uproot it, you can't, eliminate it totally, but at least you can mitigate. One of the methods for mitigation is using phosphorus acid, for instance, which is, I think, registered as a fertilizer in California, but it has some antifungal chemical. It could increase the defense response in the tree, and tree becomes a little bit more prepared against the pathogen. Next, please. Yeah, and the way that you can apply it, you could either, if the tree is young, you can spray on the bark, or you could simply inject into, in the bigger trees, you could inject into the trunk, and that's very helpful for this fungicide. Okay, next. But here's a question. I talk about DUSA, right? That most of the hats are planted right now, as far as I'm concerned, on DUSA in California. I mentioned that it's more tolerant to Phytophthora root rot. Part of that is because they could reopen their stomata after the stress. It's either infection stress or perhaps flooding stress, because they can recover from those physiological response. But the question is DUSA really tolerant to flooding stress or not? Are we planning to have any tolerant rootstock against flooding and be prepared for any occasional event in California or not? Based on your experience, have you seen any rootstock that work better against flooding or not? Let's discuss this also later. And next. Thank you all for listening to this presentation. Here's my information. If you have any questions, feel free to send an email or simply call me. And here's my lab website, Subtropical Plant Pathology. So I will provide more information there for you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Fatima. So I'm going to turn it over now to Gary Bender to give a perspective on his perspective on this issue.
Good morning, everybody. I recognize a few of my slides there. That very last slide that Fatima had there was you saw the triangle of dead trees coming down that hill. That actually was a Phytophthora problem, started at the very tip of that triangle up at toward the top of the hill. That tree was infected. And then during flooding events and things, you can see the whole triangle of Phytophthora spread down the hill and killed all those trees. So that actually turned into a UC Riverside rootstock trial. So, and a lot of the rootstocks were very poor there. That was a very virulent strain of Phytophthora cinnamomum. Okay, just a couple stories I want to tell you from my experience. I think it was about 1992. We had a lot of rain that year. I think we'd been through a long drought. I might be about 1 year off. I think it was 1992. Our normal rainfall here in Fallbrook is 8 to 10 inches a year, but that year we had 32 inches. And the previous summer, in 1991, I went out to see a 5-acre avocado grove in Rainbow. And now Rainbow has a fairly shallow water table. In fact, some of the people have to have their sewage tanks above ground and they pump them out. They can't have them buried in the ground. You know, and during heavy rain, we have some problems there. Well, that particular grove, I went out to see that. The grower said he's got some dying trees, and yeah, he did have a few that had Phytophthora, and they were dying. But most of the 5 acres looked fairly healthy. And so then we had that big rain through the winter there in the early spring, and he called me back out. He said, all my trees are dying. And I went back there, the whole 5-acre avocado grove was collapsing. And you can see just what Fatima was talking about. This, you know, a few of those trees were showing symptoms of Phytophthora, but when you're under saturated conditions for a long period of time and with poor drainage, you can have the whole grove go down. And those were in the days before we had Dusa rootstock and some of the better rootstocks that we have now. Just another experience in Vista here in San Diego County. Back in that was a heavy avocado growing area. They had a nice loam soil, but you know, they started getting Phytophthora in there, and then those were the days they didn't know really what that disease was, and it was spreading. And so during the time I was working, I got a lot of calls from homeowners. They built a lot of houses there in Vista, and almost every backyard avocado tree had Phytophthora cinnamomum, and it just didn't look good. And what they told me, one of the nurserymen told me, was Vista has a nice loamy soil, but about 2 feet down, there's a clay layer. And that clay layer would get saturated at the top there, and it made perfect conditions for the Phytophthora zoospores to just kind of move rapidly. And that was one of the things that Dr. George Zentmeyer also told me when I first started. Said there are certain areas where if there's a shallow clay layer, Phytophthora moves very rapidly through the grove. And so some of the things that Fatima was talking about, you know, one of the things is applying gypsum that can loosen up that clay somewhat. And the wood chip mulch, I think, is very helpful. Over the years, that breaks down and makes a better soil toward the top there where the feeder roots are supposed to be. But one of the things, if you're going to do a lot of wood chip mulch, you really need some moisture meters down below there to help you, you know, tensiometers and the watermarks and the things like that will help you read the soil moisture, because you can't see what's going on down there. So that's just almost a necessity for irrigation. I think that's about the only comments I had to make. Most of our soils here in San Diego County are on decomposed granite. They drain very well. We have very few instances of heavy clay layers and saturated soils. And I know some of the other counties in California have a lot worse soil conditions than we do. So I think we're fairly lucky on that. So, okay, thank you. Nice talk, Fatima. I recognize a few of my slides in there. So I'll turn it back to you, Mary Lou.
Thank you, Gary.